Bophuthatswana was very close to Pretoria, just north of Pretoria and just west of Pretoria over here. And there were huge numbers of people crowded into these areas. Most of them would work in Pretoria and its environs, and so they simply made those part of Bophuthatswana. So the townships of Mabopane and Garankuwa, which are right here. I know this because I actually worked in Mabopane for a while. They were not initially part of Bophuthatswana, but just acknowledging that this massive spot of black habitation was not going to go away, they turned it into part of the homeland. Right? Same thing down here in Ciskei. There's a large township called Mdantsane down here, very close to East London. Most of the residents of Mdantsane end up commuting to East London for work, and so they sort of incorporated that into the Ciskei. Right? But in places, especially where the township was close to the city center, they zoned these for white residents and forcibly removed the blacks from those territories. The most celebrated case of this, actually there are two, in Cape Town in the mid-1950s. There was a place called District 6, which historically, for many decades, had been the main residence of the colored population there. And in the Cape, the coloreds were quite significant in number. Well, that was zoned for white habitation, and so they tore apart all of the homes in District 6 and forced the coloreds, actually removed them forcibly by buses to a place that was much further away from the city center, which meant that henceforth the coloreds would have to commute much longer distances and be reliant on buses provided by the South African government. The other celebrated one was Sophiatown. This was just west of Johannesburg, and from the beginning of the 20th century had been a major place of black settlement. And it was mostly a shanty town, yes, but blacks were accustomed to living there, and there were multiple generations living there. One of the documents in the Williams book deals with this. This is Part 4, Section B, Document 7. This is a really interesting document. I encourage you to take some time to look at it closely. This is written by an Anglican clergyman, Anglican priest named Trevor Huddleston, who had actually been a clergyman in Sophiatown, had a church there. And even though he's English and white, his perspective on this is really very interesting, and he's sort of calling out the government, for its hypocrisy in its rhetoric and all of that, right? So he says, just to read a couple of excerpts of this briefly, on page 279, about 10 lines down from the top, freehold rights, even if amenities were lacking, were worth having. He's talking about Sophiatown being a place of great poverty where people lived in shacks, but it was still worth having, right? That was undoubtedly one of the great attractions of Sophiatown. That the people, own their own land. They own their own houses. The other was its nearness to the city. Instead of spending time and money on transport, those who lived way out at Pimville location had to do, they were within cycling distance of their work, right? So they didn't have to rely on public transportation. He says, well, the mines and the industries of South Africa obviously need black labor. They say they need black labor. Labor is labor. It is not human if it is black. It must be there, standing ready in your factory or your kitchen or your office. But it must make no demands for the necessities of life, a roof tree or an income large enough to support the home. It must have strong muscles for the job, but how they are to become strong is its own concern. It must have clean clothes and a tidy appearance in your home, but it doesn't matter where or how it is they get the water for washing or the space for drying. So Johannesburg built its factories, its flats, and its fun fairs. It forgot to build houses for its African citizens, and that's why Sophiatown existed, he says. But now they're saying they can't live here because this is white-only zone, right? At the very end, he kind of sums all of this up. This is page 282. let's see, that the thing which underlies every event of any racial significance in South Africa is the assumption that white civilization is threatened by the very existence of an African community in any way similar to itself. What he's saying here is, what should have been obvious, I think, and that is the blacks are not a different people. They have come into the modern world just like the whites have. But the whites insist that they are different, fundamentally different, that the two cannot coexist in the same space with each other. And to go back and quote the rest of this, the African in the kraal, that is the rural homestead, is in his right place. So is the African in the kitchen, meaning in servitude or slavery. But the African in a European suburb, in a European house, which he himself owns and is proud of, he is a menace. He must be removed. Right? I think Huddleston really gets this right. He is identifying again the rhetoric and the hypocrisy of all of this. The Group Areas Act of 1950 is what, in terms of legislation, made this necessary. It, as I said, zoned different parts of the urban areas for temporary black residents. And some of these places just ballooned in population. I mentioned Soweto in an earlier class. This is actually a picture of Soweto circa 1970s, something like that. This, by the way, is only one small neighborhood of Soweto. Soweto came to have a population by the late 1970s in excess of 1 million people. By the end of apartheid, it may have been 2 or 3 or more million people. A lot of the areas in Soweto, and that was only one of the many townships around South Africa. It was the largest, or I should say around Johannesburg, it was the largest, but it was only one of many. The one on the bottom here, I believe, is Freedom Square. This is close to Bloemfontein. This is a place I actually worked in for a while. It's part of the larger township called Mangaung, right? And so you can see the abject poverty that many of these people lived in these shanty towns. These are more permanent residences. These are 4-bedroom dwellings, and they're pretty common. The government did build some of this housing, but as of the 1970s, the early 1970s, they stopped doing that. By that time, by the late 1970s, it was something like an average of 15 people per house, demographically speaking, in these townships. So, with a growing black urban population, also with a stagnation of black wages, these were frozen in place. And the real wages of black Africans in the early 1970s was actually less than it had been 60 years before in real terms, if corrected for inflation. They did rise somewhat after that, partly through trade union activities by blacks, which was still deemed illegal, but it was effective nevertheless. But even at the best times, even after some progress, the average white person working the same job or something similar to a black African would earn at least 5 times as much, right? And then unemployment was just rampant. In the 1980s, the available statistics show that about a quarter of all of the black African population was unemployed, and that includes large numbers of people, not only in the homelands but in the townships. So these policies are obviously incredibly oppressive. And really do not acknowledge, again, borrowing the words from Huddleston here, the needs at all of the Africans. So we'll talk more about the policies next time, get into some of the other details of this.